performance is seldom mentioned in discussions about piracy, except when the controversial DRM Denuvo is removed from a game, which is when comparisons are made between the builds that are protected by Denuvo and builds that are not. Pirates do not generally expect to enjoy better performance than buyers, since cracks usually do not remove the game's protection and the computational load it imposes. Most cracks just bypass the game's protection or trick it into thinking the installation is legitimate, and so the game still has to spend time and dedicate hardware resources on authenticating the installation, and this might affect the game's performance. There are a few notable exceptions, cracks that actually change the game's protection in ways that affect performance. Most of these exceptional cracks were made by Empress, whose release notes occasionally detailed the changes made to the game's protection and the improvement in performance it resulted in. For instance, this is what Empress said in the release notes of the crack for Resident Evil Village. All in-game shutters, like the one from when you kill a zombie, are fixed, because Capcom DRM's entry points are patched out so most of their functions are never executed anymore. The improvement in performance was verified by Digital Foundry, tech journalists who have been testing performance for more than a decade. Resident Evil Village was not the only Empress crack to have changed performance, if the release notes are to be believed. For example, this is what Empress claimed in the release notes of the Maneater crack. This release includes new technology advancement that allows me to start removing Denuvo cancer from the EXE. It is still new, hence this is a hybrid crack between old license method and a new one that allowed me to devirtualize 102 game functions, completely restore them, and remove the Denuvo cancer from them. I devirtualized the most performance-critical game functions to ensure maximum smoothness and much better experience than the original bloated one with that cancer on every action you do in the game. This is the first claim to be tested in this video, and unfortunately, it did not hold up to scrutiny. The Empress crack had significantly worse performance than the legitimate game. This difference in performance was consistent across multiple runs of the game owned on the Epic Launcher and the Microsoft Store. This may seem sketchy until you read this statement, posted by a leading figure in digital piracy. Empress cracks have been always protected by special anti-debugging and obfuscation tools like the MIDA or VM Protect. The MIDA is a software protection encryptor, just like Denuvo, and has this to say in its documentation. The MIDA offers the chance to include protection macros, like VM, mutate, etc., in your application to fully virtualize the code inside the macro, where the code is emulated and never decrypted back. You have to avoid putting those macros in critical places in your application, like code that is executed many times per second, because the execution of virtualized code is much slower than the original code. This suggests the MIDA could cause a difference in performance between Empress cracks and the legitimate game. This wouldn't be the first implementation of the MIDA in games. The MIDA was blamed for degrading performance in PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds back in 2017. The MIDA's own website acknowledges that games may perform significantly worse depending on how it is implemented. Empress's imposition of the MIDA and VM Protect may negatively impact performance and thus offset any optimizations made to the game's original protection. On the subject of VM Protect, this is what Voxy, the Bulgarian Denuvo cracker, said back in 2017. Ubisoft have implemented VM Protect on top of Denuvo, tanking the game's performance by 30 to 40%, demanding that people have a more expensive CPU to play the game properly, only because of the DRM. It's anti-consumer and a disgusting move. This is how VM Protect says it works. VM Protect protects code by executing it on a virtual machine with non-standard architecture that makes it extremely difficult to analyze and crack the software. This is what a bad implementation does. This combo could tank your performance by a lot, especially if you are using a low mid-range CPU. That's why we are seeing 100% CPU usage on 4-core CPUs right now, for example. While I was playing, I put memory breakpoint on both VM Protect sections in the EXE to see if it's called while I'm playing. Once the breakpoint was enabled, I immediately landed on VMP0, called from game's code, which means it called every time this particular game code is executed, which game code is responsible for player movement. meaning it's called non-stop. It is hard to say if Empress's implementation was as bad as Ubisoft's, though comparing performance might shed some light. The degree to which each crack changes performance for better or for worse depends on how Empress implemented the Mida and VM Protect in that crack. Empress claims to have improved performance in the Maneater crack's release notes, but this comparison could have been made before the Mida and VM Protect were imposed. Maneater was not an isolated case. The Empress crack of Guardians of the Galaxy also performed significantly worse than the legitimate game on the Epic launcher, though the crack loaded far more quickly. While this has been a bit depressing, a few Empress releases did tilt the other way. Before I get to those results, here is a brief statement on the state of the channel. This channel is not partnered and receives no revenue. If you do notice advertisements on this video, it is YouTube exercising their right to monetize content from channels not in the partner program, with whom no revenue is shared. If you'd like to support content like this, consider becoming a patron. The Star Wars Battlefront 2 crack was perhaps Empress's best showing, as it was faster at loading the main menu and the tutorial, while also performing significantly better both on average and minimum frames per second. The Deathloop crack was another strong release from Empress, performing far better than the legitimate game on average and minimum frames per second, though the improvement in loading times wasn't quite as significant. It should be noted that there were no changes in drivers or hardware between the legitimate build and the crack. Let's move on to Ubisoft games, which have been noted to saddle an oppressive implementation of VM Protect in combination with Denuvo. The Empress crack of Assassin's Creed Odyssey was significantly faster at loading the main menu, though it was measurably slower in performance on average and minimum frames per second. This difference was consistent across multiple runs of the game's internal benchmark. Let's move on to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The Empress crack of Assassin's Creed Valhalla also showed an improvement in performance on average and minimum frames per second, as well as better frame times. However, the Empress crack took significantly longer to load the main menu and was no better at loading the benchmark. Seem Empress implemented the Mida better in these Assassin's Creeds than the two games coming up next, the first of which is Far Cry 6. The Empress crack of Far Cry 6 was significantly slower at loading the main menu and no better at loading the benchmark. The crack also performed slightly worse on average and minimum frames per second. Ghost Recon Wildlands was also another middling showing from Empress, though the legitimate game did take 5 times as long as the crack to load the main menu. The last game tested for this video is perhaps also the most significant: Assassin's Creed Origins. Back in 2019, Codex released a crack that completely removed Denuvo and VM Protect. This is what the release notes said.
This is an experimental proof-of-concept release where the Denuvo DRM and VM Protect have been removed completely from the main executable. The main idea of this project was to verify whether Denuvo affects CPU usage and overall performance of this game. We noticed faster loading times, but we'll leave the rest of the performance comparison battle to others. Here is a small text summary of what has been done. VM Protect is fully removed, 30 VM entry points. Denuvo is fully removed, 104 VM entry points. All required PE directories are fully restored, exports, imports, exceptions, TLS. Fixed around 500,000 absolute and relative code and data pointers.
The difference in performance was already tested 4 years ago, but those results may not be quite as relevant today. Let's see how the crack compares to the legitimate build in 2024. This concludes my analysis of the difference in performance between Empress releases and the games they cracked.